Good afternoon, everybody, and a very warm welcome to this joint Pinsent Masons and Landmark Chambers seminar on tall buildings in London. So my name is Nicholle Kingsley, and I'm a partner at Pinsent Masons, and I head up our London planning team. And I'm delighted today to be joined by an expert panel of speakers. But before I introduce those speakers to you, there are, I'm afraid, a few housekeeping points that I need to cover. So firstly, your microphones are automatically muted, so don't worry about that. You don't need to adjust any local settings. We do very much welcome questions throughout the session, but please submit them via the text in the Q&A section. It's either at the top or bottom of your screen. We hope we can answer as many questions as we can during the seminar, but if we're not able to do so, then we will follow up with you after the event. Now, just to note that this webinar is being recorded, but we then will send you a link to the presentation and the recording after we finish. And don't worry, if your connection is lost at any time during the webinar, just rejoin the meeting by clicking on the original link once more. So, the topic for today, tall buildings in London, where next? Now, I think the basis for this discussion came from a recent number of call-in decisions on tall buildings in London. And then, as we saw in the middle of December last year, the Secretary of State's direction on the draft London Plan, Tall Building Policy D9. So that inevitably started a discussion among ourselves. So what this could mean for future tall buildings in London. So if you're an owner or developer, what priorities should you consider in bringing forward a tall building? Should you prioritise design or sustainability, for example? We've seen the recent consultation on the National Design Code and Guide. So how does that fit with the planning considerations for your tall building? What about affordable housing and public realm as part of your priorities for bringing forward the development, or impact on heritage assets, which could increase call-in of your scheme to the Secretary of State? What about the differences as between commercial or residential tall towers? And how long will it take to get your consent? There are so many questions, and I can't say that we'll definitively answer them all today, but we'll do our best. And thankfully, I am joined by an expert panel, all with extensive experience advising on tall buildings. So first of all, Richard Turney. Richard Turney is recognised as a leading planning barrister, and he's been advising on tall buildings for several years. His most recent tall building work was the Tulip, where he joined 4-week public inquiry on behalf of the appellant. He's also acted for the claimant in challenging the Secretary of State's decision to refuse the Chiswick Curve scheme, and he previously acted on tall buildings in Hammersmith and Fulham, Croydon and Greenwich. Richard will take us through the national policy position and approach of the Secretary of State. He will be followed by Russell Harris QC, who is a leading planning QC at Landmark Chambers. He's been involved in promoting each London plan since the creation of the Mayoralty. And he's also been involved in many of London's tall buildings via appeal, call-in and negotiation. And he promoted, among others, the Heron Tower, the Shard, the Walkie Talkie, One Blackfriars, the Vauxhall Twin Towers, and many of the residential buildings in the Canary Wharf cluster, including Marsh Wall. Russell's going to talk us through the London plan and where next. And lastly, but of course by no means least, is Iain Gilbey. Now, Iain's a senior partner at Pinsent Masons in the planning team, and he's head of our residential sector. Iain specialises in all aspects of town and country planning law and related environmental issues. His primary focus is on large-scale mixed-use and residential-led projects, covering all non-contentious and contentious planning matters, including court challenges, public inquiries, and other tribunals. He has extensive experience advising on tall buildings across London and outside of London. And Iain is going to look at the local context and policy position, also with a short comparison as against tall buildings consented outside of London. So thank you very much for listening today, and I'll now pass you over to Richard.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining the seminar today, and thank you to Nicholle and Iain for suggesting that we join together to give this seminar. I'm going to talk about tall buildings in national policy and briefly the approach of the Secretary of State to provide a bit of overview and context for the rest of the talks. The first question I want to touch on briefly is, what are tall buildings? And the starting point is to note that they are undefined in national policy. Some local plans define what a tall building is for the purposes of the plan, but some don't. So the definitions that do exist vary. In London, there is a definition in the extant London plan, the plan which is about to be replaced, which refers to tall and large buildings being those which are substantially taller than their surroundings, cause a significant change to the skyline, or are larger than the threshold sizes set for the referral of planning applications to the Mayor. So that's more than 30 metres in most of London, or more than 150 metres in the City of London. But the publication London plan sets a different threshold. Russell's going to talk more about this after me, but it says that development plans should define what is considered a tall building for a specific locality, and notes that the height will vary, but that it should be not less than 6 stories or 18 metres from ground to floor level of the uppermost story. So that's the will be very shortly the new threshold for what is a tall building in London. What does the NPPF say about tall buildings? Well, it's a very short answer, nothing. It says absolutely nothing about tall buildings. It doesn't mention them in terms. However, that's not to say that the NPPF is irrelevant to or entirely silent on questions relating to tall buildings. First of all, the NPPF obviously requires good design, and I'm going to come back to this in looking at some recent changes in respect of design codes and so on. It also requires efficient use of land and delivering appropriate densities, and you'll be familiar with the provisions that require planning policies and decisions to support development that makes efficient use of land and takes into account the desirability of maintaining an area's character and setting, and seeking to optimise the use of land within the area. And in setting the Greenbelt release conditions, or the exceptional circumstances that justify release of land from the Greenbelt, there is reference again to the need to optimise the density of development and consider whether policies promote a significant uplift in minimum density standards in town and city centres and other locations well served by public transport. And as you'll know, this sort of debate as to whether urban areas have done enough to deliver housing is central to questions about Greenbelt release. And of course, there are a set of other relevant national policies to considering tall buildings, for example, the heritage policies. There is, as you'll know, a consultation on at the moment about changes to the NPPF. These are focused on the idea of building beautiful, and there is a focus on building beautiful and sustainable places, relying on character assessments, codes and master plans. And there is express support in the proposed changes to Chapter 12 for design codes, and a requirement to give significant weight to development which reflects local and national design guidance, or outstanding or innovative designs promoting high levels of sustainability. So this focus on building beautiful obviously is directly relevant to questions about the acceptability of particular forms of development, and in particular, in this context, tall buildings. Turning to the planning practice guidance, again, there's no direct guidance on tall buildings. There is reference to relying on evidence of the defining characteristics of the area, including townscape character. Townscape, again, is not actually mentioned in the NPPF itself, but it does appear in the PPG. And there's reference to the National Design Guide, which has recently been updated. So then the National Design Guide, there's a new version of this, which came out about 2 weeks ago. It refers to tall buildings in a couple of places, noting that well-designed tall buildings can play a positive urban design role acting as landmarks, emphasising important places and making a positive contribution to views and to the skyline. And then noting that proposals for tall buildings require special consideration. That includes matters relating to their location and siting, relationship to context, impact on local character, views and sightlines, composition, and general environmental impacts. So there is some guidance in the National Design Guide in respect to tall buildings, but importantly, an encouragement for the principle that tall buildings can play a positive role in urban design. And then there's also live at the moment a consultation on the National Model Design Code, which notes that there may be a need in some areas to make provision for taller buildings. And in the guidance notes for design codes, there's some more reference to tall buildings, noting that it may be appropriate to include criteria for the locations of those buildings in some area types, and noting that a tall building would be any structure that exceeded the general height guidance for a particular area type. Now note the difference between that threshold and the 6-storey threshold, which has appeared in the publication London Plan, and which doubtless will be adopted shortly. The design code, or the guidance notes for design codes, also sets out tall building principles, in summary, topography, characterization studies, heritage assets, local historic character and conservation areas, transport accessibility, identified long views and skylines to be protected, sensitive local views, vistas and gateways. So a rather extensive list of matters which need to be taken into account when considering the appropriateness of tall buildings when setting design codes. And of course, there's other guidance. So whilst national policy is relatively quiet on tall buildings, at least in express terms, we do also have the benefit of Historic England's Tall Buildings Advice Note. There's a new iteration of that under consideration. It's been updated numerous times. But of course, one needs to be careful about treating HE's advice as policy. Of course, HE view the matter from a specific direction, namely the protection of heritage assets, discharging their statutory duties. And there will inevitably be, in tall building cases, a balance to be struck between impacts on heritage assets and the benefits of delivering tall buildings and the intensification of land use that they can provide. So that's an overview of relevant national policy considerations. Just briefly, before I hand over to Russell, I wanted to touch on the Secretary of State's approach by way of overview. First point to note is that, as many on the call will understand, in numerous cases, the Secretary of State has called in or recovered appeals in respect of tall buildings, and in even more cases has given directions whilst he considers whether or not to call in particular applications. So tall buildings are plainly an area where the Secretary of State takes a direct interest, and that is both in London and in elsewhere, and central London, as well as in the outer London boroughs. So there's clearly an interest in the department in the way in which tall buildings are consented. As to the Secretary of State's approach on determinations, I'm afraid to say I can't give much guidance. The determinations are highly fact specific and of course, to some extent, both in deciding whether to call in or recover and in determining, influenced by local politics. But I think what you can see from the decision letters that we have is a lot of weight being given to the protection of heritage assets, a lot of focus on design quality, and in that respect, it's worth noting that the Secretary of State, at least in the Chiswick Curve case, and doubtless in others, has taken his own internal departmental design advice. So having received the recommendations of an inspector on the quality of the building's design, he has nonetheless gone on and sought the advice of an internal civil servant on the question of the design of the proposals. And of course, politics cuts through all of it. And that means that necessarily where these proposals are politically controversial, the outcome may be influenced by those political controversies. And then the next point about the Secretary of State's own approach is, of course, in plan directions. We've seen that most notably in London, but query whether the Secretary of State will take an increasing interest in other plans on the basis of their tall building policies, particularly where they may relate to urban intensification and densification as against greenbelt release or development beyond existing urban areas. So more to see there, I think, in the future. For present purposes, I'll hand back to Nicholle so that Russell can start on the plan directions.
Thanks very much, Richard. And we'll come back to you for some questions a bit later. Over to you, Russell.
Welcome, everyone. I hope you can hear me. I'm going to talk about the London plan perspective. And here are some tall buildings. That's the cluster of the City of London and the Shard in the background, just to provide you with an image to whet your appetite for what's coming. This talk is going to consider the future direction of tall buildings policies in London. It'll explore the most relevant, very soon to be finally published London plan policies on tall buildings and the Secretary of State's directions in relation to them. It'll seek to answer what those policies mean and whether they disclose an approach to tall buildings that is more restrictive than before. But as ever, to understand where we and these policies are going, it's important to grapple briefly with where we have been and why. Back in 1998, not very long ago, Parliament was told that an exhaustive study of tall buildings for the London Planning Advisory Committee had concluded that there was no overwhelming evidence to suggest that there was a need for radical change in London's skyline. It was said not to be necessary. It wasn't necessary to secure, sustain or enhance London's importance as a world city or to create a new image of London for Londoners. Economic analysis was said to have been undertaken, and that economic analysis confirmed that very high office buildings were not required for London to maintain or enhance its world city role. In short, LPAC decided there was no evidence to support arguments that London would lose jobs to other world cities if high buildings are not developed. And as a result, in 1999, look at the date, remember the date, it produced a guidance note relating to tall buildings in London. It was, as you'd expect, given what we've just seen, restrictive in tone and in substance in relation to tall buildings. It was a sort of happy marriage for those who weren't keen on tall buildings. It reflected the left-leaning, sort of anti-business stance of many of the Labour boroughs at the time, and at the same time the more protectionist position of many of the bluer out-of-London boroughs. The document pressed for what it called more gentle density. Now there's a thing. I wonder if we'll see that term coming back. More gentle density in the form of mansion blocks and ground scrapers. The guidance was contained in supplementary planning advice, and I give you there the nature and extent of it. And that document, if you read it now, seems a tad out of date. It perpetuated a nervousness and lack of strategic London-wide thinking about the benefits of tall buildings in the right location, which had left London with one of the most underdeveloped skylines in Europe. So there we are. That is where we were back in 1998, 1999. And with that guidance, that LPAC guidance saying it didn't really need to change very much, how did that become this within 20 odd years? And how might it be this by 2023 if a number, I think there are 3 appeals shown on that graphic, if they are granted? How did we go from not needing to change the skyline at all to where we now are? And how did this happen at Canada Wharf? And how might that happen in Croydon? Well, there are 3 reasons why, and each of them by themselves wasn't sufficient. And I'm going to spend a bit of time on the 3 reasons because they flow right the way through to where we are now in policy D9 of the very soon to be adopted London Plan. The first was Ken Livingstone. And whatever you think of Ken's politics, he profoundly believed in the concept of London as a world city. And he knew from individual briefings and requests from international developers, banks, Swiss Re, etc., that contrary to the LPAC advice, there did appear to be a very pressing need for further, taller, more prestigious buildings in the city and elsewhere. And he understood if he was going to deliver this, because he was sympathetic to the needs of the banks and the finance houses, etc., he knew that he could simply not ignore or rip up the recently published LPAC 99 advice. He was a shrewd character, and he knew that without it, the vacuum would lead to prematurity refusals. He knew that there needed to be some form of policy framework in place. So instead of saying he didn't agree with LPAC, he told Parliament that he would subtly add to the criteria, which were negative, contained in LPAC. And that's what he did. He produced his own interim guidance on tall buildings. And if you look at it with a careful eye, you'll see that he really wasn't just adding, he was transforming the LPAC guidance. Just look at the first 4 or 5 additions that he said he was going to place in addition to the LPAC advice. Clusters, drawing attention to locations of civic or visual importance, interesting skylines when grouped together, focus, momentum, publicity to areas undergoing regeneration. This wasn't just an addition of some criteria, it was a whole-scale rethinking of policy. And in this way, the mayor, Ken Livingstone, shifted the entire tenor of the negative LPAC advice under the cover of amending it. It became a criterion-based and largely positive in principle policy, containing no stymie on location in its terms. And the relevance of this interim guidance note is that it has become now policy 77 of the present for now London Plan, and has, with minor amendments, been the policy since 2002, say, that has allowed the alteration of the London skyline, the creation of significant clusters of high quality tall buildings, and the radical densification of large parts of the capital. And it remains important because large parts of that Ken policy matrix remain also in the soon to be published new policy D9, although D9 has a different locational bent, as we'll see. The second reason that these tall buildings have come across and been built, notwithstanding the LPAC guidance, was the Heron Tower inquiry. It was the first big tall building inquiry post the interim advice. It took place in 2000, and Bridget Rosewall, who's since become very famous in the planning field for her review of planning procedures and the advice that she gave the Secretary of State, in that case appeared as a witness live and advised that in commercial terms, contrary to LPAC analysis, she believed, and the evidence was there to support it, that there was need for clustering, need for large floor plates, and that both those needs were accepted by the Secretary of State and by the City of London. It was a transformational acceptance at a national level that tall commercial buildings were an important part of London's future. And at the same time, the Gherkin was built. In fact, the Gherkin was going up at the time of the Heron inquiry, and it immediately became a successful building, both in architectural terms, in functional terms, and in townscape terms. It became iconic of the world city. It featured on the candidate city bid for the Olympics, for example, and it underscored the value of tall buildings. It rather gave a lie to, it was said, the LPAC conclusion that tall buildings weren't relevant to image. And the third reason why we went so quickly from saying we didn't need any tall buildings to where we now are was the way that local authorities, particularly in areas where strategic tall buildings were said to be relevant and important, realised that they delivered and delivered quickly. So the City of London under Peter Rees and Maggie Hampson saw the spatial challenge from Canary Wharf and from Frankfurt and the benefits of clustering set out above, and they embraced that. Croydon saw the opportunities of meeting office space need quickly too, and Tower Hamlets accepted that a cluster around Canada Square was needed for the same reason. And here's an interesting thing. Once the potential for tall buildings was established, the ability in planning and other terms to deliver more slender, more elegant, smaller footprint residential development to meet very pressing housing need was seen by those boroughs as inescapable. Hence the rapid delivery of mixed clusters of tall buildings and eventually planned clusters of residential buildings at transport nodes. And I mentioned there Lewisham. So where does that leave us? Those three things meant that we didn't stick with LPAC. We ended up with the present London plan for the next day or so, probably. And if you look at the adopted plan as it now sits, policy 77, which deals with tall buildings, reflects Ken Livingstone. If you look at those bullet points, I needn't read them all out, they're very, very similar to the bullet points that were amendments to the LPAC 1988 advice. So they've stood the test of time. The one thing you'll notice is they are criterion based. There's no locational stymie in the sense that if you pass these criteria, then inspectors and Secretary of State decisions have held that you can be granted your permission, notwithstanding that you aren't in an area which is identified as suitable for a tall building. So in other words, past these criteria, they are freestanding benchmarks of acceptability for a tall building. You don't need a locational policy sitting above them. So the new London plan, how does it change all that? Well, first an update of where the London plan is, and we've already had two questions relating to this, and it isn't wholly clear. We do know that all of the Secretary of State's directions have now been addressed. The Secretary of State signed those off on the 29th of January. We do know, according to the website and to the mayoral officers, that the document will formally be published when statutory notice periods are passed, and that is literally any time now. And so I think as we sit here, we are right in the transition from the old plan to the new. I think in absolute truth, the old plan is still part of the development plan, but it's almost passing away as this webinar goes live. As to the nature of the Secretary of State sign-off, well, it was not wholly positive. He did say that all of his concerns had now been dealt with, but there were many threats of further intervention, including the need to direct review and an assessment that the present London plan was wholly inadequate in relation to its delivery of housing. So although it was signed off with a tad of ill grace. And as others have mentioned, including Richard, there was a curious late direction on tall buildings policy, which was submitted only in December, just before Christmas, and has been dealt with by a small, brackets, but significant, close brackets, amendment. As Nicholle said, the key tall building policy is D9, and we should spend a bit of time on that. Well, policy D9, in its largest part, in the sense of the body of the text, reflects and continues much that was contained in Ken Livingstone's original policy 77. The impacts section of the policy changes little. They are development control type tests, they are criteria, and they followed through from where the London plan was. In addition, context remains important. Thus, we are told in the text accompanying the policy that in large areas of extensive change, such as, and I would add, not limited to opportunity areas, the threshold for what constitutes a tall building should relate to the evolving, not just the existing context. So much of Livingstone's broadly supported text remains, and low areas planned for extensive change, regeneration areas, opportunity areas, parts of town centres, for example, can change by the addition of tall buildings. The fact that they are low-rise at the moment, even in the new London plan world, does not mean that tall buildings are inappropriate. But there are three important distinctions and differences, I would say. First and most importantly, the policy and its supporting text give new and important locational and procedural guidance on how individual boroughs should identify appropriate sites or areas for tall buildings. And I'm going to spend a bit more on that in the next slides. So new and important locational and procedural guidance. Second, specific requirement is now embedded in the document to have regard to cumulative impacts of existing and proposed new tall buildings. There was such advice in SPGs on World Heritage Sites, for example, and in the HE guidance that Richard Turney spoke about earlier. This is the first time that that guidance has appeared in policy terms in the London Plan. And third, there's no necessary support, specific necessary support in principle for tall buildings in opportunity areas or in the CAS or in the town centre as before. There are a lot of decisions which accept that tall buildings in opportunity areas are in principle acceptable. And that is less clear now. So what does it say, policy D9 in locational terms? Well, it says these three things and they're all important. First, it says boroughs should determine if there are locations where tall buildings may be an appropriate form of development, subject to meeting the other requirements of the plan and consultation. Second, any such locations, that's where there is may be appropriate as tall buildings, any such locations and appropriate tall building heights should be identified on maps in development plans. So you need formally to identify locations and heights on the plan. And third, tall buildings should only be developed in locations that are identified in development plans. Look at that really carefully because we're going to come back to that in a slide or two. Tall buildings should only be developed in locations that are identified in development plans. So a restatement, and some would say a significant strengthening of the plan-led approach to tall buildings. In shorthand, you can only have them, according to this policy, in locations identified. But there's a procedural element to the policy as well. Very detailed guidance is contained in D9 on how such development plan locations are, as a matter of fact, to be identified. And we're promised supplementary guidance too, which can only be very technical in nature. I've set out here what the plan itself says. It says boroughs should determine and identify locations where tall buildings may be an appropriate form of development by undertaking the steps. So you comply with the policy that I read out earlier, but only if you undertake these steps. You have to undertake a sieving exercise, for example. 1, you've got to determine the maximum height following that sieving exercise. 2, and then 3, you identify those locations and heights on maps and development plans. It goes into great detail, and the supplementary guidance will go into greater detail on the visual aids, on the techniques, on the science, on the methodology, and on the kit that you'll need in order to do this. It's going to bring stuff that we're usually used to seeing at Section 78 and other calling inquiries back into local plan formulation. In terms of heritage assets, before we go further, there are new policies too, which are relevant to tall buildings. Policies HC1 and HC2, in terms, protect heritage assets and World Heritage Sites for the first time, specific reference to World Heritage Sites, from any harm. It's as simple and straightforward as that. they protect those assets from any harm. And if you look at them, neither they, HC1 or HC2 or D9, contain or indeed even refer to the balance of balancing harm against public benefit that's contained in the NPPF. Paragraphs 195, 196 will be familiar to most of those on this call. For me, that's a surprising omission. The panel thought it was a little concerning too, but the adopted plan, or the finally published plan, HC1 and HC2 do not contain that balance. However, in applying these draft policies to date, and in giving them great weight, because they weren't affected by the Secretary of State's directions, the Secretary of State himself has recently found that tall buildings which cause any harm do breach these no balance policies, but not necessarily the London Plan when read as a whole, and further that even where the London Plan as a whole was breached because a development caused some harm to a heritage asset, schemes which bring public benefits which outweigh that harm, in line with the NPPF, result in circumstances where material considerations would indicate a decision other than in accordance with the plan. The most recent and the case where this was argued out most fully is the Citron site, and I've given you the reference there. So what does that mean? I'm going to summarize what I think are the main changes that result from the mayoral change of policy. We'll then go on to consider what the Secretary of State has done. And I think the main changes in the mayoral policy are as follows. Support of the local planning authority and eventually its development plan as to the location of tall buildings is enhanced as a material consideration. The views of the local authority, and especially if they've been expressed through a development plan, are and will be given greater weight. Second, and most importantly, likely for those on this call, developers much more than ever need to engage early and fully in the local plan process to ensure their sites are now identified as appropriate locations for tall buildings. Coming in later is less likely to be successful. Third, in framing their approach to local plans, developers must engage early with the now new procedural guidance contained in the supporting text and promised SPD. Local plan submissions will need to be much more hands-on. They'll need to involve the techniques that we're more used to seeing at inquiries, and they will help or seek to help the local authorities to identify locations scientifically as part of the submission to the local plan process. Fourth, once a site is within an area suitable for tall buildings, the Ken Livingstone tests remain largely in place. You can't ignore them. It's not a green light. Those development control tests are still very often tough to meet. And finally, if things go the way they have so far, then even though the policies in the plan don't contain the balance contained in the NPPF, the national policy on heritage harm is likely to be determinative on that issue. And that makes sense if you look at the balance between harm and public benefit. It would be strange indeed if you ended up with a situation where in London, public benefit exceeded harm, but you nevertheless had to refuse. That's nonsensical because planning is there to ensure the public benefit. When we bring ourselves to the Secretary of State's late intervention on tall buildings, those on this call will know that the Secretary of State intervened heavily in the London Plan, issuing very powerful and wide-ranging directions in relation to housing delivery, in relation to opportunity areas, in relation to industrial land, and it goes much wider. But there was no direction on tall buildings at all, until that is the 10th of December 2020, and no explanation was given by the Secretary of State as to the lateness of this intervention. Doesn't need to give any explanation, but it was strange to see it come in this way. And the extent of the intervention is puzzling to many. It was pre-advertised as a fundamental shift in power between the mayor and local planning authorities on tall buildings. And you'll see, in practice, it might still be. But the nature of the intervention, particularly when you look at the 2 words that were added to the policy of relevance to this, is not immediately revolutionary. The nature of the tall building intervention on its face was as follows. It was summarised by the Secretary of State in the following way. This direction is designed to ensure, my emphasis, that there is clear policy against, my double emphasis, tall buildings outside any area that boroughs determine are appropriate for tall buildings, while ensuring that the concept of gentle density, an LPAC concept, is embedded London-wide. And the covering letter for the direction, dated the 10th of December, says this: I'm issuing a new direction regarding policy D9. There's clearly a place for tall buildings in London, especially where there are existing clusters. However, there are some areas where tall buildings don't reflect local character. I believe boroughs should be empowered to choose where tall buildings are built within their communities. Your draft policy, that's the one we looked at earlier, D9, goes some way to dealing with this concern. In my view, we should go further, and we'll see how that comes about shortly. Here we are. Here's the alteration sought. And so far as the delivery of tall buildings is concerned, it involves simply the addition of 2 words to the text we looked at earlier. So B1, as before, but it does include determination of where tall buildings may be appropriate. B2, as before, must be identified on maps and development plans. B3, as before, except instead of in location, should only be developed in locations that are identified in development plans, there is the addition of the words as suitable in development plans. Now, the mayoral team must have been mystified by this. Directions must be exceptional and must be timely. Here, the late addition of 2 words, they thought, and you can see why, added little to what was on any sensible reading already contemplated in the text and in the policy. You could only have tall buildings where the development plan says so. The direction on that basis has been accepted on the basis that the mayor thinks it changes little. But is that right? Are these 2 words that say nothing but mean a lot? When read in wider context, and having regard to the background noises emanating from the department, the words, there are only 2 words, might, and I think do, signify changes. I think they signify the government's view that greater weight should be given to the views of local authorities, and that tall buildings should not be foisted on authorities by strategic decision making. I think the use of the term boroughs should be empowered to choose suggests a new balance. They are given a power they didn't have before. I think it also signifies support for authorities who in effect say, no tall buildings here. We'd rather gentle densification, thank you. Third, I think it signifies a requirement that areas be positively and firmly identified as suitable in order for permission to be granted. There used to be a category, those of you on the call will remember, as sensitive to tall buildings. I think it's aiming at the potential for those areas to be developed for tall buildings. And like Nicholle and like Richard, I think it also identifies a greater intention to police tall buildings by call-ins or recoveries in London, where sites are not deliberately and specifically identified through the specific processes that we've seen. So my conclusion and my main message, the role of the development plan in specifically identifying suitable locations for tall buildings is undoubtedly now enhanced. Sites need to be positively identified as suitable. That means that developers must engage more and earlier in local plan processes substantively and, importantly, procedurally. That's the big takeaway from this talk. Third, the wishes of local planning authorities will be afforded more weight by the decision maker, and this cuts both ways. Local planning authorities will be empowered to choose tall buildings where they think that's appropriate, as well as to reject tall buildings. And the wishes of the local planning authority in that respect will be given more weight. So finally, some personal thoughts. And they are personal thoughts. They're not landmark thoughts. They aren't Pinsent Mason thoughts. They're my thoughts. I think there's a long-term risk to this potential rebalanced approach. And that is that the London-wide strategic approach to the delivery of tall building development at the right locations, an approach which in the round has been mostly successful since the creation of the Mayor of London in delivering densification on brownfield sites across the capital, well-placed, public transport, etc., that is inappropriately derailed by the natural fear of change brought about by tall buildings on an individual borough and community basis. If boroughs, especially outer London boroughs, are given the choice of something called gentle densification, which sounds wholesome and lovely, and why wouldn't you want gentle densification, and brings with it the undeserved contrast with the rougher densification of tall buildings, it's understandable why they, like LPAC, might take the gentle and politically easier route. And sometimes that will be right, and sometimes that will be appropriate, and sometimes that will be what the context demands. But that will not always be the correct approach in terms of spatial planning, sustainability, architecture, or beauty. Here's a building of beauty which would not pass the pattern book approach, which would not certainly get built if one was looking for gentle densification, but is probably one of the best buildings in Europe, if not the world. So care is needed in circumstances of this case, not to be gentle with your densification. Nicholle, that's all from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Russell. That was very interesting. And no doubt we have lots of questions for you a bit later. So I'll now pass over to Iain. Thanks, Iain.
Thank you very much, Nicholle, and thank you, Richard, for setting the scene so well. And Russell, frankly, hard to follow, Russell, both wide-ranging and passionate as ever. So thank you, fantastic sort of run through of history, recent history, and the current situation that we find ourselves in. Just a few reflections from me, following on from Richard and Russell, thinking about the role that tall buildings play in regeneration and in the delivery of affordable housing. And then, as Nicholle said at the beginning, just some thoughts about the role of tall buildings outside of London as well, in a compare and contrast exercise. So I wanted just to start by talking a little bit about perception and reality and trust. As Russell outlined in his slides, tall buildings create concern and distrust. They polarize opinion. Certainly one of the first tall buildings, if you can call it a building, that I was involved with was the Millennium Wheel. And when that was first mooted as an idea by David Marks and Julia Barfield, there was, I think, in some quarters derision, and in other quarters significant concern. It is now one of London's best loved, I think, landmarks, and universally known and admired throughout the world. So there is a concern that tall buildings polarize opinion and tend to be regarded with a degree of skepticism. But as Russell's final slide this afternoon highlighted, they can be things of great beauty, and it's important that the planning system engages with them positively, not negatively. And I think the cumulative policy changes that Russell's taken us through this afternoon lead us to a more negative policy context in London than we've been used to over the last 15 or 20 years. And I would say probably a more negative policy context than we should have, bearing in mind the important role that tall buildings play in both our architectural life, in our skyline, and importantly in economic generation and growth. And the role that tall buildings play is exemplified by the city cluster, by the ongoing regeneration and development of Croydon, by the Shard, of course, which again is now, I think, universally admired as a fantastic piece of world-leading architecture. But in the bottom left-hand corner, for those that know it, you've got Pitt Meadow House in Birmingham, described by the August Journal the Sun as being England's worst tower block. And I think that's the perception and the trust issue, particularly in the residential sector, that needs to be overcome, and isn't always addressed, to my mind, by the way in which planning applications are put together, consulted upon, and communicated to local communities. So I think if tall buildings are going to continue to have a role, particularly those providing high quality residential accommodation, then there needs to be greater trust and greater communication between local authorities and their communities, and developers and their communities. And that's obviously an issue that transcends the entire development community, but I think it's particularly important in the tall buildings debate. I think the other problem in this space is that development has largely led policy. On this slide, which is focused very much on Tower Hamlets, bottom left, for those who don't recognise the toothpick, South Quay Plaza. South Quay Plaza was conceived as a project well, back in the late 2000s, just coming up to 2010, was originally consented by Tower Hamlets in 2014. There's been subsequent changes to the scheme, but the main consent was granted in 2014. Subsequent to that, the policy has sought to catch up with the Isle of Dogs and South Quay. So the South Quay Master Plan arrived in the following year, October 2015, and the Opportunity Area Planning Framework didn't arrive until October 2019. And of course, a further overlay of supplementary planning guidance in Tower Hamlets, the high density living SPD, only arrived at the end of last year. So it's very difficult, I think, for both communities and developers to know what rules they're playing by, and I think that's further exemplified by Russell's tour de force analysis of the direction the London Plan is now taking us. And I'm concerned that without a strategic policy direction, and this continued kind of tussle and tug between the Mayor of London and the Secretary of State, it's going to be very difficult for developers and landowners, local authorities and communities to understand and to predict how new tall buildings are going to come forward. And I think that's a retrograde step for London in its place as a world city in a post-Brexit and with COVID world as we go forwards. So you could characterize the policy context that Richard and Russell outlined as something that might amount to an apparent presumption against tall buildings and a policy landscape that's designed to change. And it's interesting to see how the LPAC guidance was amended and manipulated by Ken Livingstone and what that has led to. But I think for all the reasons that Russell's outlined, we're now taking a pretty significant step back. And that reflects the political tension between obviously a government of one political complexion and a mayor of a different complexion, probably piquancy added by the fact that the Prime Minister used to be the Mayor of London. So that tension, that political tension has been played out through the London Plan process and has led to the confused, I think, position that Russell outlined earlier. And the reality and the consequences of that confused position and that lack of strategic delivery and oversight means that tall buildings promoted in London take a very long time to work their way through the planning process, even those on sites which are clearly earmarked or even allocated for tall building delivery. We keep a very close eye on mayoral call-in and Secretary of State call-ins in London, and I was working my way through the list of mayoral call-ins, and there's getting on for 30 to 40 of them over the last 10 years or so, and on average any proposal with a tall building in that's been subject to mayoral call-in can expect to add 18 to 24 months to the planning process. And I suppose the question I would ask is that acceptable in a world city? Is it acceptable that the planning process in some instances can take 6 to 7 years to deliver a tall building when these tall buildings are so important, both in terms of delivery, but also emblematically in terms of signalling our intention to the world? They're also important in terms of the delivery of private for sale units, build to rent units, and increasingly alternative residential, for example, later living. And if we're not able to achieve the outward expansion of London, and certainly the Mayor has sought to add further policy constraint to green belt release over and above national policy, then the options for densification are limited, and the role that tall buildings did play and should continue to play will be very, very important. I think the other point, which again, something that Russell touched on, is the diminished role, it seems to me, of opportunity areas and housing zones. These were something which were embraced, I think, very fully by Boris Johnson during his mayoralty, and certainly I attended many presentations from the Mayor's office extolling the virtues of opportunity areas and housing zones as being a very important policy tool for delivery. But my sense is, and I think the London plan, as it's now emerging, de-emphasises the role of those areas and those zones, which again, I think is to the detriment of delivery. And of course, it's not just housing delivery in the generality that is suffering. It's importantly affordable housing delivery. Yes, there are policy and funding interventions that can be made, but the vast majority of affordable housing delivered in London is delivered by developers and is cross-subsidised and cross-funded by the commercial residential development that's delivered. So if there are less high density tall buildings being delivered in those locations, there will by necessity be less affordable housing. I think the other changes that the London plan will now lead us to is this federal approach to locational imperatives for the delivery of tall buildings, as Russell has explained. The boroughs will now be given more scope and more power to direct where those tall buildings go within their borough, or they might make it so difficult that it almost becomes impossible to deliver tall buildings in some boroughs. And you can think of a few in West London that might fall into that category. And again, I think that's a retrograde step. Tall buildings of world-leading quality and architectural class should be matters of strategic importance and should perhaps not be completely handed over to the Mayor, but there should certainly be a greater balance of power between the strategic planning authority and the individual boroughs. And as for the reasons that Russell has explained, my sense also is that that power has shifted markedly as a result of the way in which policy has changed in the new London plan as it emerges. I just wanted to finish with some thoughts on out of London. This slide, I think, is very interesting in terms of the very stark contrast between what can be achieved in London and what's being achieved out of London, particularly in terms of affordable housing delivery. Now, of course, this is just a straight relationship between land value and the ability for the private units to fund the affordable units in many respects. But it does, I think, show that outside of London, it's going to be very difficult for tall buildings to deliver the affordable housing requirements of those cities. And certainly in Birmingham, we've seen a number of projects which have delivered 0% or slightly above in terms of affordable housing because of the land value and costs associated with delivering tall buildings. And I think that creates a real problem going forwards, because if you're not able to deliver the value and thereby the affordable housing in those locations, then that will place greater pressure for delivery on the periphery and potentially on greenfield or greenbelt sites. So I don't see tall buildings as being the answer to the urban renewal and urban regeneration of cities outside of London in the same way, for that reason. I think, although outside of London there is, if not an actual presumption, an implied presumption in favour of and largely a supportive policy environment, if there isn't indeed a policy vacuum. It's interesting in Birmingham because the new Our Future City plan, which is a reboot of the central core Birmingham plan, emerged at the end of January, and tall buildings are mentioned in, I think, 30 or 40 pages, are mentioned just twice. So again, I think a failure for authorities outside of London to have formulated sufficiently their planning approach to tall buildings. And that might lead, and that policy vacuum might lead to bad decisions or decisions which are not robust. And we've already seen that in Birmingham with the One East Side project, which was the subject of judicial review, failure to take into account heritage impact issues, or more particularly failure to take into account representations received from the Victorian Society on heritage impact issues. So if authorities outside of London are going to grapple with the tall building challenge, then they're going to need to move quickly to fill the policy vacuum. In a with COVID world and the need to repurpose and replan and regenerate our city centres, I think there's going to be pressure on local authorities to reuse existing buildings first before allowing large new buildings to deliver the residential accommodation that will be required. So in summary, I mean, I think it's impossible and it can't be overlooked the important role that tall buildings have to play in delivery, and so much of the volume of delivery in London over recent years has been underpinned by or flagged by or supported by tall buildings, and therefore it's important that we grapple with the issues that we've raised today, and in particular those raised by Russell. As Russell has outlined, the clear direction of travel is to a plan-led rather than location or opportunity-led approach. That was an approach that obviously delivered a vast amount of new development in the period after the global financial crisis, with a large influx of foreign investment, sovereign wealth investment into Vauxhall, Nine Elms, Battersea, for example, and into parts of Tower Hamlets. So we need to be agile, we need to be nimble, we need to allow those international capital flows to continue to come into London, but the way in which the policy is being formulated through the new London plan, I think will certainly make that more difficult. The boroughs need to grasp the opportunity afforded to them to direct tall buildings within their boroughs, and this shouldn't be seen as just being a constraining policy approach. It should be an enabling policy approach with the ability to direct and deliver more quality. Again, this overarching move to gentle densification shouldn't be at the expense of high quality schemes well located. I think finally, public concern and perception needs to be properly addressed. Consultation needs to be done properly, and I think as we move into this more plan-led approach to tall building locations, we can see the need for landowners and developers to work more closely with the London boroughs and with the communities that they house, to ensure that the policy context is created in the right way, so that the buildings can eventually be delivered more quickly going forwards. Thanks, Nicholle.
Thank you. So thanks very much to all of our speakers. I'm going to move on to some questions now. Just before I do, and if everybody could now turn on their videos so that we can have a discussion. Just before I do, I had a couple of my own just for each of you, and then we've got a number. We have been answering some questions as we go, but we'll then address some of the others that have come in. Richard, starting with you, if I can. We're in a position, if we assume the local authority does have an allocated site or an appropriate location for a tall building. You mentioned the national design codes. How do you think that they will then play in amongst the other competing priorities in terms of delivering your tall building?
Well, I think the starting point has got to be the identification in a local plan of an appropriate location. And something that occurred to me looking at one of the questions in the Q&A as well is that tall buildings are not just about urban design, are they? They're about land use, because they're not just a typology of building, they're also a way in which you can deliver an intensification. So there's more than just urban design. And so I think clearly design codes are going to have to grapple with tall buildings where they are relevant to areas which have been identified as appropriate for tall buildings. But I think it's really for higher level policies in the plan to identify what those locations are, whether they are particular locations or whole city centres or opportunity areas generally, or whatever they are. But I think it has to be the plan first, and then the articulation and the design code of principles to apply that.
Thanks. And you know, as we saw with the white paper, there were a number of, I think, responses and a bit of scepticism, I think, in relation to whether or not certainly national design codes would stifle innovation. And I think we've seen, haven't we, with tall buildings quite often, they are very innovative and they're forward looking, and they sort of breach the existing mold in terms of what's there already. I mean, do you agree that those design codes could stifle, if it's so restricted, even in terms of a local community level, and what the local community then imposes their sort of design code requirements, that itself will also, if you get over the location barrier and hurdle, that will then also stifle tall building development coming forward?
Yeah, I think that is a risk. The way in which it's been dealt with in the London plan is to of course previously to identify the highest standard of architecture as being required for a tall building. And then the city plan, for instance, setting a requirement for world-class architecture. So you have to, in those policies, they're not prescriptive, they're not design codes. They say you've got to show that your architecture is exceptionally good, but without saying it must have, you know, this approach to fenestration or something like that. So most of what we see in the design codes or in the model design code, and the kind of thing, the thinking at the heart of it is much more about sort of more routine design, replicable design that can be repeated across a whole series of streets in an area or new developments. Whereas tall buildings, I think there's probably much more scope to say it's got to be really, really good design, but we're not going to add anything more to that by way of a design code, because no one can quite know what really good design is until they see it, as Russell has said in submissions quite recently.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And that's one of the points as well, I think, that Iain made too. Thanks, Richard. Coming on to you then, Russell, if I may. You did mention obviously the slight change in approach that we've heard, and actually, do you think in your mind that then means that we've missed an opportunity in the opportunity areas to optimise development, if obviously the local authority doesn't then identify it as a location appropriate for tall buildings?
I do. I think there is a missed opportunity here, and this picks up on one or two of the questions that we've been asked and I've tried to answer as we go along. if you look at the way the policy is drafted, it says that tall buildings should only be allowed where the development plan identifies them as suitable. That's paraphrasing the policy as directed to be changed. Now, the development plan consists of more than the local plan. Here, it consists of the London plan and also the local plan for the relevant area. And I think that the London plan should have taken a more hands-on approach to identifying areas that were in principle suitable for tall buildings, using the sorts of tools that it requires local authorities to adopt. And it couldn't have done it on a map basis because the order doesn't allow that to be done. But it does allow general areas where tall buildings are in principle suitable to be identified. And I think it should have done that. And I think any review of the plan should do that, because I think where tall buildings go is just about as paradigm a strategic issue as it's possible to be. And I think that the suitability of tall buildings can't just be read at the local level. I think it needs to be read at the local level, guided strategically. And of course, local plans have got to be in general conformity with the strategic plan. And I think an opportunity was missed to ensure that tall buildings remained part of London's generic makeup where they are appropriately located from a strategic point of view. And that would have had to have gone through panel review. Secretary of State could have intervened, of course. But I think that part of the process is as yet incomplete. And I'm all for plan-led tall buildings, so long as A, there are appropriate exceptions where the public interest demands it, and B, so long as it is appropriately, strategically and locally considered. And I think we're in danger of starting at individual communities, which are powerfully important, but planning is about more than just that.
Yeah, no, I agree. And you mentioned the review. I mean, there's certainly an argument, isn't there, that given the length of time from when the London plan, publication plan, was first consulted upon until now its adoption in the next few days, we assume, that a great amount of time and indeed a massive and significant change has occurred. Should it be almost immediately reviewed or have an early review? And I assume from your answer that's, you know, one of the areas that actually they should look at, because I agree with you, the plan itself and the role of the mayor is supposed to be strategic. So
I think an almost immediate review is essential, and but it almost always is actually. Every London plan that I've done, we've sort of had the wrap party on the Friday and started the new London plan on the Saturday.
Yeah, apart from at the moment, obviously we can't go and celebrate down the pub. They're not open. Okay, thank you, Russell. Iain, then finally to you, and then I'll move on to some of the questions. We still have a few minutes left. Given the apparent constraints that you've highlighted, and in terms of the presumption, really, unless you're identified in the local plan, for tall buildings, what do you think then developers should prioritise when they're looking to bring forward tall buildings? Or maybe the answer actually there is in the question in terms of the plan-led part. But is there anything else other than that that you think, you know, developers and landowners should focus on to make a success of bringing forward delivery of tall building?
Depends on your audience, Nicholle. It depends on your consenting route. As you know, on many projects that we've been involved with, the first question is, who do you hope to get planning permission for? And the answer is subtly but importantly different. If you're hoping to get planning permission from the borough, whether you're expecting the mayor to call in the application, or indeed whether you're expecting the mayor to call in the application and then be trumped by the Secretary of State. So it depends on your audience. I mean, I think classically you need to deal with everything, but the local priorities that the borough and their community will have, I think, will be subtly but importantly different to the Mayor of London's priorities. And when I say priorities, it's essentially affordable housing delivery is the main priority that the Mayor of London has, understandably, perhaps across London. And therefore, depending on who your audience is, will depend on how you communicate and articulate the offer that your scheme brings forward. But my view is, for tall buildings to be successful, you've got to hit all of the sustainability, design, affordable housing, public access, public realm issues. They've got to be respectful, and they've got to think about the space around them, not just the space within them, to be successful. They've got to think about their context. They've got to think about the wider context, as Russell has described, in terms of the strategic issues and views, etc. So I think, I'm afraid, Nicholle, the answer is you have to think of everything, but the emphasis, I think, is subtly different depending on who you expect or ultimately hope is going to give you planning permission.
Thank you. And we've got a few more minutes that we can turn to some of the questions that we haven't already answered. Picked up a few. One of them, I think, is for you, Iain, actually, if you don't mind. It's a question as to whether or not tall buildings, do you think that they've become less favourable or less favoured following, actually it's both COVID, and I suspect that might be in relation to commercial but also residential, and also the issues with Grenfell and the cladding issues that we are still following in terms of government's approach to it.
Yeah, well, this is my trust and perception point, Nicholle, I was trying to make earlier. I mean, I don't think tall buildings are inherently less. I have to be careful as I say this, because I think it's such an emotive subject. Tall buildings don't have to be inherently less safe. I think that obviously the issues that have occurred in the very tragic circumstances of Grenfell and other projects means that there's very much a heightened awareness of the risks around the construction materials and the way in which those buildings are managed. But tall buildings don't have to be inherently less safe than medium or low-rise buildings. But I think public trust and confidence in them has been much diminished by what's happened over the last 3 or 4 years. And obviously the government's announcements yesterday will go some way to addressing that, perhaps, although the development industry's response to it in terms of the development tax, which is being mooted, will need to be very carefully balanced and I think carefully communicated if we're not going to fall into the same polarisation as I think we've done in the past. So yes, I think we are emerging into a different environment in a with COVID. I don't think there is such a world as post-COVID. Actually, I think it's a with COVID world. And that means that there's going to be greater need for good open space and good amenity space around these buildings. And there's going to be the need for increased, enhanced and very responsible building management as well. And all of that adds to the cost, the delivery cost and the ongoing cost, of course. Yeah. And that will need to be factored into projects properly from the outset.
Thanks, Iain. Final couple of questions. One for you, Russell, I think, actually. Obviously, politics, as you say, plays a huge role in all of this and planning. Do you think, actually, we now are at a position where we're going to get a blame game, Labour versus Tory, Labour boroughs, Labour mayor versus government, for not delivering enough housing or not delivering enough development, full stop, as a result of where we seem to have ended up?
There are two answers there. The first is the straightforward political answer. With politicians acting as politicians, they will inevitably blame those who are standing against them in political elections for whatever it is they see as a failing. Just stepping back from that, though, the second position is a sort of quasi-judicial position where the Secretary of State has got to decide whether to recover cases, how many to recover, in what context, and whether to direct changes to emerging development plans, etc. And I'm bound to say I've heard it said on more than one occasion, on both sides of the fence, that in this case, the Conservative government is calling in lots of housing to make the Labour mayor look bad, and the Labour mayor is blaming the Conservatives for the inability to produce housing in order to make the Conservative government look bad. And I would hope that that's not happening. I would like to think that there are differences between the parties and they're trying to work it out. So I'm not going to be so cynical as to say that it is definitely party politically driven. But the other thing I will say is I've worked for mayors of all descriptions and colours, political parties, since the mayoralty was formed, and I've never seen the relationship between the mayor and central government be as bad as it is now. Yeah. When it started with Ken Livingstone, going right the way back, and there was a mixture of Conservative and Labour jurisdictions, there was something called the Government Office for London, and we used to sit in meetings with the mayoral team, the government team, and I can assure you that everything progressed for the benefit of Londoners. Whichever of the parties were involved, it was a very cooperative working environment. And I think there's a level of distrust now that means that that isn't happening. I don't think it's necessarily party politically driven, but it's an unfortunate and dysfunctional relationship.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's very unhelpful. I mean, it goes back, doesn't it, in terms of the white paper proposals as well. The classic sort of duty to cooperate, and we know that actually a lot of London boroughs don't talk to each other, and obviously tall buildings have an impact wider than sort of the local area usually. So if the mayor and government can't seem to get along, I just think it's really unhelpful for them to have such a public spat to get, towards each other, and actually they should be working together, as you say, for the benefit of London, in terms of the Mayor of London and London as a whole. So I completely agree. Right, I think probably final question, if that's okay. Richard, there has one come in terms of what does somebody do then once the London plan has been adopted, or indeed, sort of after adoption, it will take a little while, won't it, for local plan process to catch up. So what do people do in that instance?
Well, it will take a while, certainly, and it could be a long while, given the way in which plans progress in various London boroughs. I do think if you've got existing clear guidance in a plan that says tall buildings acceptable in this location, and there are such plans in London, not all of them, but there are such plans, then I think you can find a way to make policy D9 and the existing guidance work, although with the caveats Russell's given about the different terms of D9. I think if you're in a situation where there is no guidance in the borough concerned, or that guidance is demonstrably out of date as compared to the guidance given in, or the policy framed in D9, then potentially you're in a difficult situation, and it's simply going to be a question of showing either that you can justify your scheme as a departure from the development plan, or that you can meet enough of policy D9 to say, overall, I am in compliance with that policy, in the way that we sometimes find a way to persuade inspectors and others that we might not tick every box, but we tick enough to say policy compliance. So not straightforward, and clearly the risk increases quite substantially for a promoter in such a location.
Okay, thank you. Well, I for one could chat for a number more hours yet on this topic, but I think we should wrap up now. So thank you very much to all of our speakers. I'm sorry if we haven't got to answering your questions, but as I said at the beginning, we will make sure that we follow up with you and respond to those questions. I was just going to conclude with a couple of remarks from me following the discussion that we've had. I mean, it does seem to be clear that there are additional constraints and barriers to delivering tall buildings in London, and as we heard, not least the plan-led, the local communities and local planning authorities. identifying in the local plan an appropriate position for tall buildings. From my side, and I agree with Russell, I think an opportunity has been missed on opportunity areas in particular. I love advising on tall building developments, and I've been very fortunate to advise on some of London's well-known and loved tall buildings. I think the space that they create and the fantastic views and the skyline it's exciting. And dare I say it, and it's been mentioned actually a couple of times already in this discussion, but tall buildings, well-designed exemplar tall buildings are, you know, exciting and beautiful. Maybe I'm biased because I have lived and worked in Dubai and there are some amazing tall buildings there, but I think London is one of the best cities with amazing tall buildings, high quality, well designed. And I think it has to be right, doesn't it, that in the right location, if you have a high quality, well designed tall building, that must be the sensible way forward to meet. I mean, this is not just about housing need, it does help deliver housing, but also the commercial mixed use development requirements for London. And it also, I think, optimises brownfield sites while leaving us some space around to breathe. So I'm sorry we have run out of time, but just finally to say thank you very much to all of our speakers, Richard Turney, Russell Harris QC and Iain Gilbey, and also thank you to all of you for joining us, and I hope you have a really good rest of the afternoon. Thank you.